Alrighty then, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hey everybody, it's awesome to see so many folks here. As Randall said, actually started up this group in 2011, and I think at our first meeting we had like 6 people there at a very small co-working space, and I wasn't sure if anybody would care or come to a JavaScript meetup here in the Twin Cities, and I see that I am super wrong. It's continued to become more popular, so that's really cool, and I thank Brandon and Randall for doing a great job after I passed the torch. Yeah, absolutely. About a year and a half ago. So yeah, it doesn't have anything to do with my talk, but I do work for a company called Twilio. We're an API company that lets you do text messaging, send and receive, make and receive phone calls. We have a chat SDK, a video conferencing SDK, a two-factor authentication SDK. So if you would happen to need any of those things, definitely check us out. Feel free to ask me any questions about that. And I actually am also hiring. I'm the only Twilio person in the Twin Cities. It would be pretty awesome if that were to change at some point in the future. Most of the company's in San Francisco, but I work remote, obviously, from here in the Twin Cities. So if you are a front-ender, somebody who would be interested in using Vuejs at work, then maybe come talk to me or shoot me an email. My email address is just kw@twilio.com, and I'd love to hear from you. So what I'm here to talk about this evening is a framework called Vuejs. And it's, as I mentioned, it's a framework that we've been using at Twilio for some of our front-end stuff for a while, and I've really come to enjoy it. So I thought I would share a little bit with you about the basic syntax of the framework, some things I like about it, and then also dive into a more complicated usage of the framework, so you can kind of see how you might use it in a larger scale application than just the sort of hello world level example that I'll show you in the browser. It reflects a lot of the patterns that we use like in our front end build tools, and if you have any questions as we're going through that, or going through anything in fact, make sure to let me know. So I'll maybe start off with why I like Vuejs. And Vuejs is definitely not like the coolest thing to be using right now. Like I think if I were to be like fully front-end JavaScript like buzzword compliant, I would have used React and Redux and that whole suite of tools. And it is actually really cool. I don't have anything against that framework. But what I really like about Vuejs and why I ended up kind of hitching my wagon to it about a year ago is because of an analogy that I make a lot about APIs and API design. So what we're looking at here is something that you probably don't have in your house anymore, but it's a universal television remote. And when you were to pick up something like this and use it with your TV, your intended use was probably just to like make the volume go up or down or change a channel. But if you want to do those things, you have to wade through tons of hardware buttons and apparently like a touch screen and like 2 power buttons. Like, what's that about? Like the remote has power and the TV has power. And a lot of APIs out there today are like this. Like you come to a framework with a very specific use case in mind. Like I need to update some data here and then make it show up on my web page. How do I do that? And there's a lot of frameworks out there that help you do this and are really good at it. But when you come to that framework, you have to grok a lot of stuff before you can actually start like realizing any kind of value from the framework. So you contrast that with something that you might use with your TV today, like the Apple TV remote, even though there's a new fancy like touchscreen, like sort of trackpad version of this now. What Apple did well with the Apple TV remote is progressively revealing complexity. The stuff that you're most likely to want to do is featured prominently in one of a few hardware buttons, like starting or playing and pausing the movie that you happen to be watching through iTunes. And the rest of the things that the platform can do, which are incredibly deep and complex, are progressively revealed to you as you use the device. And I think that great APIs are designed in this way as well. A great API will immediately demonstrate value and be very useful in very simple use cases. But as your use case continues to become progressively more advanced, it'll grow with you and it'll reveal the complexity of the framework as you start to use it. And that is something that I think Vuejs has done really well. It's very simple to use to start getting value out of it right away. But if you use it in a more complex application, you'll find that it grows really well with you and has a lot of the features and bells and whistles that you might expect to find in a much larger framework. We'll start off by kind of going into some of the basic syntax. We'll be looking at Vuejs 2.0, which released a couple months ago, but it was actually very similar to Vuejs 1.0. I was very happy to learn. So we'll kind of go through some of the basic syntax to show you how it works, and then I'll show you a more complex application. It's not necessarily rocket science, but it shows a lot of the things that you might do if you were to integrate Vuejs into a larger application, like the one that we work on during the day. So to start using Vuejs, all you need to do is include the script tag for Vuejs on your page, which hopefully I'm not going to mess up my fiddle here, and create a DOM element that you'd like to mount your Vuejs component on. So I've sort of pre-populated a little bit of JavaScript here to create a new Vue component, which is going to be mounted to this application DOM element. And there's a couple of things that I've left blank here that we're going to set up as we go along. Now, the first one we'll look at is the data object. And one of the things I really like about Vuejs is there isn't like a magical object with a special API that you have to update to update the data that backs your application. You're just going to be working with a plain JavaScript object. It can be regular arrays, objects, object literals, or whatever. But the only caveat is if you want a property to be reactive, which is to say, like when you update it, the user interface will be updated to match. You do have to declare it up front in this data object. So I'm going to make a very simple to-do list application, and I'm going to start with a text field that will contain the new to-do list item. So we'll call that new to-do, and we'll initialize that just to be an empty string. And now in my markup, I'm going to create a couple fields that are going to consume this data from my Vuejs model. So I'm going to start with an input. And then I'm going to use some Vuejs directives, which if you're familiar with AngularJS, you might see this type of syntax in line with HTML tags. And the directive that I'm going to use here is Vue model. And then to that, with that attribute, I'm going to pass in the property on my Vue model that I want to bind to this text input. In this case, it's going to be new to do. And then the value of this is going to get updated, whenever that thing happens to change. And then just to show that it's working, I'm going to output the current value of new to do in just a little paragraph tag down there. If you'd like to output data from your data model, you do that with double mustache brackets like you see here. And like a lot of other templating engines that you may have used, you can use filters to transform data from your model in various ways to uppercase it, downcase it, convert it into currency, something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and run that. And now I have my input over here. And now I have my two-way data binding set up where I'm updating my Vue model from my input, and then I'm immediately updating or outputting that data into the object. So this in a nutshell is really like kind of what hooked me on Vue, is because a lot of times something as simple as this is all you need to do. Like, no, I don't need your like server-side rendering framework or like your router or whatever. I just need some data binding. And if that is all you need in your application, like Vuejs has got you. You don't have to do all that other stuff. And in fact, in our application, it's a CMS where a lot of the content is actually rendered on the server side. So Vuejs plays really nicely with server-rendered applications if that's something where if that's closer to how your application behaves today. All right, so we've got an input here, and now we don't want to just output whatever is there into a paragraph. We want to actually start to make a to-do list application. So let's go ahead and create unordered list, which we're going to paste those to-do objects into. And when when we update this and somebody hits enter inside the text field at that point, yes, question, go for it.
Just a quick question, and not too deep, but this is like exactly the same as the Hello World, like Angular 1 too, right? I'm just curious, like, what are the kind of just, because I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with Angular 1 as well, like, so what are the differences in how this is working versus Angular? Because Angular 1 isn't cool anymore, obviously. So.
Yeah, I know. Angular 1, definitely not cool. Yeah, it's like the prototype JS of front end frameworks these days. Yeah. I don't think so, man. I don't think Backbone's cool anymore. I still like it. I don't know if it's cool anymore. Anyway. The primary difference, I think, is in the implementation. So the data flow for Vue.js components, similar to React, is like one way. Like the way in which they render the chunk of the DOM that's being changed has more in common with React than it does with Angular, and like the way that they track, because like their browser support is like IE 8 and higher is what it is. The way that they track changes to the view model is slightly different as well. And actually, if you want to, this is really great. Our team at Twilio does documentation, and this guide for Vue.js is actually super nice. I'm going to steal a lot of ideas from it. But if you want to sort of dig into that, they have a document which compares it to other frameworks. And Evan Yu actually does a pretty good job kind of explaining how it's different or inspired by other frameworks as well.
Thanks, yeah, I didn't mean to sidetrack
there. No, it's all good. It's sidetrack away. Sidetrack away. All right, so we've set up our data binding already, but now we need to start adding some behavior to this application to make it actually do something. So when we want to bind behavior on our Vue component to things that happen on the DOM, we can use a variety of directives to do that. In this case, we're going to use the von directive, which will allow us to assign JavaScript functions to events on this element. In this case, we are going to listen for the key down event, and I'm going to use a modifier for enter. This syntax for directives with arguments and modifiers is actually pretty well documented in the guide that I just showed you. But anytime that the key down, or we have the enter button down, I want to call a method called add that I'm going to define on my Vue controller down here. So I'm going to create a new function called add. And for starters, all I'm going to do is alert the current value of new to do, just to make sure everything is working the way that I would expect, which is definitely not guaranteed when you're doing it from scratch like that. So it looks like I type it in, I press enter, and then my data is being updated there as I would expect. So now I've wired up the enter key press to this method on my Vue controller, on my component. And now I need to render, sort of start tracking a list of to-do items. So I'm going to add a new attribute in the data object here. I'll just call that to-dos, and I'll initialize that with an empty array, although it could have some initial value there as well. And now in my add, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the current value of the to-do item into that array, and then I'm going to blank this out so that we're ready for a new to-do list item once that happens. And now I need to start actually rendering all of the current items in my to-do list. So there's a directive in Vue.js for that called v4. And then to that, I pass in an argument which will set up a variable while I'm iterating the list of to-dos. So for to-do in to-dos, I'm just going to render out the current to-do list item in that list right there. All right, so we have the beginnings of a very basic to-do list application here. In just a little bit, with just a little bit of extra markup in our template, and 13 lines of pretty easy to understand JavaScript. So yes, question.
Yeah, on the beyond, so with your for different events that you guys train, like how would you enumerate if there were other sentences? How would that affect it if you were doing this on mobile? Is that gonna key down enter, dot enter, is that gonna be affected?
I'll answer the second one first, and then maybe clarify the first one. Yeah, sure. So the question was for an event like key down, it doesn't necessarily exist on mobile. I think key down enter does, but like for click, say, which doesn't exist on mobile, what happens? I don't think that Vue.js like magically maps click to a touch event. I think there are other touch events that you can bind handlers for. I don't think there's a translation. I mean, there is a translation at the browser level, like a click will happen after touch up, but.
And then enumerating them, like if you were trying to attach, listen for an key down or swipe or some other, like you want to have multiple events you're listening to, how do you?
I think it's possible to chain together events. I'd have to look at the way I've done it is just I actually do repeat it 3 times. Like if there's 3 events that I'm listening for, I have 3 attributes there. I think there is a way to chain them. I don't know off the dome what that is. My apologies there. All right. So this is kind of the very basic stuff with Vue.js. And it's, if your application is, largely server generated, and your needs really are like just above the jQuery level, using Vue.js in this way ends up being a really nice fit. But for more complex applications, Vue.js has a rich set of APIs and tools that you can use to build out the most complex single-page applications that you can probably imagine as well. So I'm going to show you a better to-do list application that has been enhanced with some additional features from Vue.js. And this application, introduces some friends from the Node.js ecosystem that I often like to use when I'm building Vue.js applications. So this application that you were about to step through is up on my GitHub account. So if you go to github.com/kwhinnery, Vue-Basics, you can check out this application, dig through it, and see what's there. And probably you won't want to use any of it, but in the off chance that there's some code that you might want to reuse, feel free to drag that out. So in our Vue application, one of the nice things about a framework like React, say, is the design of components ends up being pretty nice. Like all of the styling and the structure and the behavior of a component within the application lives within probably the same file, and is like, again, it's geographically, if you will, located around the same area, which makes like understanding what a component does and reusing components quite a lot easier. So Vue.js actually has a very similar type of interface that you can use if you so choose. You do have to use some Node.js-based tooling. In this case, I'm using a combination of Grunt, Browserify, and Babelify. So Grunt is a general-purpose task runner for JavaScript. Browserify allows you to package up common JS modules in the Node.js style for usage in the browser. And then Babel and Babelify by extension is a Browserify plugin, which uses a transpiler called Babel, which I'm sure a few folks or more are probably familiar with. and allows and basically transpiles ES6 and more advanced JavaScript features that might not exist in the browser into cross-platform ECMAScript 5 JavaScript that you can use anywhere. Yes?
Yeah, so which one of those is allowing you to use this style tag with the links tab?
So this is, if you look over here, it's too tiny to see it, for which I apologize, but this file is an app.vue, and that's a Vue specific thing. So the Vuejs plugin for Browserify processes these single file Vuejs components into a plain JavaScript function, which kind of smashes all of this stuff together into a JavaScript function that just runs in the browser. So this is allowing this to happen is magic of the Vuejs component. There's also a plugin for Webpack if that's more your bag than Browserify. So let's actually kind of back out from here, and we'll start in the package.json for this project so we can kind of see what the shopping list is of the modules that we're using in this example. And maybe even if we back out further, if we look at this application, it does very similar stuff to what we had before. It's just a to-do list application, but this time you can also remove to-do list items. If you click on one, the title of the to-do gets logged out to the console. So it does a few more things, and we'll dig into the Vuejs code here in just a minute. But this application is set up to work with a Node.js server, which right now is only serving static assets. But obviously, if you're running Node on the back end, you might use Express, which is the web framework I use here in Node, maybe as your API server or something like that. So the only hard runtime dependencies we have are Express and then Pug, which is the new name of the Jade templating engine, because the Jade folks, I think, got a nasty letter from a lawyer that they couldn't be Jade because it was a trademark or something. So now it's Pug, and you can use that, and it's the same syntax as Jade was before. But during development, we have a couple more dependencies to make some of the magic happen in this project. I mentioned Babel before. Babel, again, is what allows us to use more advanced ES6 and beyond features in the browser. So this Babelify plugin for Browserify allows us to do that in our code. We use Grunt for actually serving up the application and packaging up our assets. Grunt, again, I'm just all about the old busted technologies, I guess, but I still use Grunt. I still like it, mostly because the ecosystem of plugins for Grunt is very large and mature, and I don't usually have to futz with them. And yeah, I like it. I think it's easier for me to reason about for synchronous tasks than something like Gulp, which I think is closer to the newest hotness than Grunt is anyway. And then we use a couple of Grunt plugins. There is a plugin for Browserify. There's a plugin which allows us to run multiple tasks concurrently. And then we are going to watch for changes in our front-end code and our back-end code with watch and nodemon respectively. We're also going to pre-process the CSS from our single file Vuejs components with Sass, which is just a superset of CSS, which gives CSS some special powers. If you don't use something like Sass or less, it's super fun, and I would recommend you check it out. And then we have Vuejs, the core library itself, and then Vuejs, which is that Browserify transform, which takes that single page component file, which we'll dig into in a moment, and transpiles it into a JavaScript function that will work in the browser. So the grunt file, which you can dig into in the GitHub repo, is configured with a few tasks, but the default task is to run Browserify to initially package up the JavaScript file, which will serve up to the client and put it in our static asset directory. And then I have a concurrent task that's going to be watching my front-end assets and my back-end assets and restarting my server if the back-end code changes and re-browserifying my front-end code when the front-end code changes. So I don't have to continually run those tasks. And the output, when you run grunt, looks like this. You initially have Browserify creating app.js, and then we use NodeMon, which is again a great tool for automatically restarting a node process when your code changes. Both running in the background. And if I go out to my browser code, here's app.js. This is the bootstrap file for my front-end application code. And if I make a change, I missed a semicolon there. Kevin, come on, buddy. I know it's not strictly necessary, but it's necessary for me. And if I make a change and come back out here, Browserify has run again and has rebundled my application code. So I'm sure a lot of folks, if you've been working with these front-end tools for a while, likely use one or many or all of these tools. So if you're interested in one way you can mix them together, feel free to kind of look at the grunt configuration here and riff on it as you will. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this app.js file, this is like the entry point for my front-end application code. And when I run the Browserify command to package this up for the front end, it creates this file, which actually is what ends up in the web root of my Node.js application. And what Browserify does is create a sort of standalone CommonJS module environment that you can load up in the browser, and it makes Node-style module exporting work in your browser code as well. So there's a little bit of boilerplate there. And then also Browserify will package up all the necessary dependencies you have from NPM and include that in a single script, which you can ship to the browser and use to run your front-end code. So this is the unminified output of the Browserify process. But to bootstrap the application in this way, I'm going to require the main Vuejs library, which will allow me to create a Vuejs, like a one large Vuejs component, which I'll mount to an element in my page. And then I'm going to load up one of these single file Vuejs components and render that into the DOM element in my template. In my template here, here's my very simple Express application, and right now I just have one route which is going to render a pug template, and that template here just has a title, and then that app element where I'm going to mount my Vue application, and then it also loads in that browserified script that we saw a few seconds ago. So in this app.vue component, this is going to be like sort of the top level component of my application. And it'll have a couple of children within it, which are other components, which we'll see in a second. But just to go over the structure of a single file component in a Vuejs application, there are going to be 3 tags that you'll see. There'll be a style tag, a template tag, and also a script tag. And these 3 components come together to allow you to create like a reusable Vuejs component. And as some of you pointed out already, for the styles and templates, you can actually use other compile to CSS or compile to HTML languages. In this case, I'm using Sass rather than plain CSS, and I'm also using pug templates for my template rather than HTML and CSS. There's lots of different renderers that you can use beyond pug and Sass, and many of them, or most of the ones you would hope are supported, are indeed supported, are in Vuejs. These just happen to be the 2 that I chose. And then in our script tag, this is just a standard Node.js style CommonJS module where I'm requiring my local dependencies, which is going to be a list item, which is one of the which is each individual component that we saw in the UI, and I give my Vue component a name. In this case, app. I'm not going to end up using it in my markup because it's the top level component of the application. And here's my data function. Now, in the simple example, we saw out here before, data we just set to be a object literal. But you can also set the data property of your component to be a function which returns an object which will be used for the data that backs a Vue.js component. So in this case, we're going to be returning an object which contains the kind of the same stuff that we had in our simple example before, a string for the new to-do, and then a list of to-dos. In this case, we do have a couple default ones. In addition to the data, we're going to declare a couple components that we want to be available in our Vue.js, in this particular Vue.js component. So the list item is a custom component that I want to use in the template for this component. So I can declare them here, or I can register components globally with the Vue object. I could require Vue and then say Vue.Component and then pass in an instance of a component that I would like to use across the application. So you don't have to register them locally for every control if you don't want to. It kind of depends on your preference there. And then I have the instance methods for my component. And this does pretty much the same thing that we saw before. It allows me to add a to-do to the list and then update the to-do model to be a blank string once we've added a new to-do. Now scrolling up a little bit, here is the template for the top level Vue.js component. This is actually, you'll get a compile error if you don't do this, but your template must have one and only one top level element. So like I can't have sibling elements at the top level of my template. There has to be only one at the top level. And then within that, I have my h1 and I have an input which does kind of the same stuff that we saw before with the enter key up command. But we have a couple new things that we didn't have before. So we have this list item tag. And obviously, list item isn't an HTML tag that you can just use. It's a custom component that I've created in the application. And this down here is what allows me to use that list item component in my template. So for the list item component, we can still use the v4 directive to render multiple versions of that list item component. And when the remove button is clicked, we have some logic here, which is going to remove that to-do list item from the array. And then here we are actually binding the value of a property of the child component to some data value that we currently have in scope while we're rendering this list. In this case, the current string to do in our to-do list. And this is where the syntax starts to be a little similar to what you might if you've used React before, like the way in which you interact with properties and events with a parent and a child object starts to be a little bit similar. So a custom component in Vue has a list of props, which they straight jacked from the React nomenclature. And those properties are initialized from a parent that is creating a child control to set some initial values for the child component. So in this case, I am going to set the value of the current to-do to the title of my child component. Now what I could do is actually just go like this and set up an attribute called title. And when I initially create the child component, the title would still show up when it was rendered initially, but if the underlying data for this to-do object was changed, the child object would not be updated. So the syntax for making that, for binding that to the underlying data just requires that you use the vbind directive, which again, thankfully is covered in the Vue.js guide if you take the time to read through.
Coming from? That's not like a click or something else that I recognize. Where is that coming from?
Such a great segue, my friend. Awesome segue. Thank you so much. I was looking for the right way to do that, but the question was, where is this remove event coming from for v-on? Like, where is that remove event getting fired? So to go back to like the React.js comparison, when you create a child component in a React app, You pass in properties that are then rendered in the child, and if the child wants to communicate back up to the parent, it fires custom events on itself, which will bubble up to the parent. So properties are passed down to the child, custom events are fired back up to the parent. So if we look at the ListItem component, we have a click handler on the button, which emits that remove event. So that's where that piece comes from. And then here we have a click handler for the anchor tag, and then for that click event, there's a modifier .prevent, which, as you might expect, prevents the default behavior for the link, so it doesn't append the hash to the end of the URL. And there are a couple of such modifiers for DOM event directives like this one. And then in our actual component declaration down here, we set up the name of the component, and this is the name of the custom HTML tag that consumers of this module will use in their templates. And then ahead of time, we declare any properties that this component accepts as arguments. So here we have that title property, which was passed in here when we created the ListItem component. So the properties can be an array of strings like this, or it can be an array of objects which define like the type that the property needs to be, whether or not it's required, whether or not there's any validations that you want to perform on arguments that are passed into the component. So there's a lot more features you can use there. And then I just have a simple method here to log that message out to the console when one of those individual list items is clicked. And that's kind of the extent of the code here. Again, the sort of the machinery which compiles everything together. It might be best to kind of look at the grunt file and go through the README and run it yourself to kind of see how that stuff comes together. But this is really all the code that you need to write. And there's a lot more boilerplate here than we had when we were just using Vuejs directly in the browser. But the benefit is you can create these single file components, which makes it really easy for you to create reusable components that you can use in a larger scale application than the one that we threw together in our JS fiddle. For the syntax highlighting here, there's a Sublime Text plugin, and there are some other syntax highlighters out there for other editors that will properly highlight a Vuejs component file. One other goodie that I will also point out is there is, which you can get from the Chrome store, there's some ViewJS Devtools extension for Chrome. And you can see that it allows you to inspect the root application, and then you can kind of drill down into each individual component in your application and see like, all right, I have one app object with 2 list items, and then you can kind of drill in and see what the current values of properties are for each of the items in your application. So a definite must-have if you have a very large tree of objects in your application. It allows you to kind of peek through it and inspect the current state of the application. Definitely recommend doing that. You'll also notice this Vuex tab, and this is a newer feature of Vue, which is actually a third-party library. And if you need to do more complicated stuff around maintaining shared state, so you need to have a kind of a global state or some kind of shared state across multiple components that don't have a direct parent-child relationship, there's a technology called Vuex, which allows you to do that, which serves a function similar to Redux, I believe, would be the corollary in the React world. So once again, the code for this out on my GitHub repository. Feel free to check it out and see how these pieces come together. If you haven't tried Vue, I definitely would recommend it. It does pass my smell test for a great API, which is that it starts off very simple, starts providing value right away, and then scales up very nicely as your needs mature. So I definitely hope you check it out. And if you have any questions right now, I can answer those. Otherwise, feel free to grab me after the talk. Yes?
Can you speak to the Vue CLI at all?
Yeah, so the Vue CLI, again, fairly recent development. It helps you bootstrap projects for Vue.js, and that's pretty much all it does right now. What it does do, if you use the Vue CLI and you generate a Browserify project, it spits out a Browserify project which is like pretty much fully loaded. Like it has like hot module reloading and integrates a lot more like bells and whistles than I have in this simple example. So it's definitely worth checking out. It currently will spit out Browserify and Webpack based projects. They don't have a back-end component. It's just front-end stuff. It runs with a Node.js web server, but like there isn't an Express app behind it or anything like that.
Thanks.
Other questions? Yes.
I was wondering if you could just show off some of the shorthands. I went to the guide and it took me a little bit to figure out what they were doing with shorthands.
Yes. Sure. So for this v-on, like for some of the directives that you use a lot, like v-bind and v-on, there are some shorthands that you can use in your templates. It messes with pug a little bit, which is why I don't use it. But in regular HTML, rather than using v-on, you can just say like @click, and that's just like a shorthand for v-on event. And then for the binding, if I go to this other one, v-bind, you can just drop the v-bind and just use a leading colon, and that's the shorthand for declaring a binding. So those are the two big ones, and I think there might be a couple other ones, but those are kind of the ones you'll see a lot.
Are there instances or reasons why you want to separate your different components, your styling, your template, and your different components in separate files? And if you do that, is there a way then to pull it all together if you want?
The Browserify through Vuejify actually does pull it all together into a single JavaScript file, which is kind of wacky because like the CSS is actually inlined into the JavaScript too, and there's some magic which includes it on the page. But ultimately, it does all get like through the Browserify process kind of concatenated together. Now, Browserify lets you have multiple output files. So if you want to have like one file which contains a certain subset of modules, and then another which might contain a page-specific set of modules, there's some configuration you can tweak to do that. What we do in addition to this would be like we also have some Sass files that are not component specific, which we compile and include in the web root by themselves. And like we have a grunt task which handles that stuff also. Yes.
What is the organization behind Vuejs, or is it just some sort of?
Yeah, it's the organization is one guy essentially. His name is Evan Yu, and he's an ex-Googler, and he's been like on a crowd-funded spirit quest to like build Vue.js essentially, which is something which as like somebody who's like betting on Vue.js like makes me a little nervous. But the team has grown over time. Like it's not just him. There's quite a few other people that work on it. But it's a much smaller like core team than maybe a lot of other folks. But that would be maybe one of the other drawbacks of Vue.js is because it is not like the community isn't as large as like a React or Angular community. So you're going to find fewer Stack Overflow questions, fewer tutorials, fewer blog posts, which is a definite thing to consider. And like Old Man Whinnery doesn't usually go for that sort of thing, but like in this case, like the API is well designed enough where I'm okay with it. So, yes.
So what does debugging your script look like in this? So once it gets compiled, is it Browserify mapping those files in as well?
Yeah, so you do have a Browserify source map for the controllers. So if we go in here into sources, we actually have our single file components here, and I can go into my components. I can set breakpoints and do that kind of jazz as well. So Browserify provides that source mapping, and Vuejs does some stuff to help that out as well. in addition to the tool we saw before to inspect the state of the modules. So, yeah.
So I'm curious about the state management because I've worked with React and Flux that turned into a big hairy ball pretty quickly. Do you have any experience with bigger applications and how to avoid those pitfalls that React has? Because the structure looks the same.
I mean, I think the reason Vuex exists is to solve like the same set of problems that Redux does. And in like our production application, like we use it in conjunction with server generated code. So like a lot of like the heavy lifting is shared between client and server. So we haven't really run into those scale problems. I haven't run into those scale problems firsthand, so I can't really comment at this point. Dan, what's up?
I'm gonna walk a little closer to the front because I'm fascinated by the fact that your talk included Grunt and Browserify. And so I actually want to use this as an excuse to do a quick little poll of the audience. And it is going to be a Webpack versus Browserify and a Grunt versus Gulp poll, because this is something that I'm super curious about right now. Particularly as a person who is a Browserify evangelist and thinks Webpack is like the worst thing that's ever happened.
Well, I think Webpack is fine, but I also
so can we just do a quick show of hands? Who is currently using Browserify?
Depends who's paying me.
My hand's up for this one.
Browserify.
Oh, wow, not
got
many.
a focal.
How many are currently using Webpack?
We are losing.
Oh my
losing.
God. Okay, and how many are currently using Grunt?
Grunt. Grunt users.
All right, and Gulp. Interesting. So we are on the losing side.
Yeah, we're definitely, yeah.
All right, cool. That's all.
Which is totally fine. Yeah, totally fine. You can use Webpack from Grunt. There's actually a Grunt plugin for Webpack if Webpack does some stuff that you happen to need. Yeah.
So with 2.0 and the feature that they added about server rendering, I was just wondering if you could talk about like the use cases, like when you want to do that and when it makes sense.
And if I can interject, that'll be the last question. So.
Okay. The server render, like the use case for just server rendering generally is that you can present like a fully baked page to the user when they load up the page, and the initial experience will get them going faster. So it's primarily a UX concern. Previously, like it would be more of like an SEO concern too. So like if a bot was crawling your page, being able to do server rendering would put all the content in the page so the Googlebot could see it and index it and do all that kind of thing. Although in theory, the Googlebot is supposed to be smart enough now to load a page, execute JavaScript, and then index the content on the page. But I mean, that would be the use case. Like when you'd want to present a UI right away without any kind of like flashing or loading type of thing.